Hi everyone. So in the video I'll make today, I'm gonna try and talk about the differences that I've experienced between teaching for a year in a school in outer suburbs away from Melbourne, and how that compares to a school that's inner suburbs in Melbourne. And there are quite some differences that I want to talk about in this video. Just a little disclaimer, if the VIT, the organisation that manages teachers, watches this video, and if you think it's not appropriate, just send me an email and say, look, we don't think you should be talking about those things for these reasons. This is why it breaches the code of conduct. And if you do that, alright, I'll take the video down if you can show why I've breached the code of conduct. I'm publishing this video because I don't think I'm breaching any codes of conduct that I'm obliged to, adhere to. So yeah, VIT, if you watch this and for some reason it's not appropriate, just send me an email and I'll probably take it down. But otherwise, I think the things I'm talking about here are very appropriate. I'm not naming people, I'm not naming schools, I'm just talking about my experiences working in schools in Victoria, because I think this information should be available to people who are thinking about becoming teachers, or who are people who are already teachers now and just want to hear someone else's perspective, right? And I think the things I'm going to talk about are very familiar to teachers, because a lot of the stuff I say has already been said to me by other teachers. So I don't think I'm bringing anything new to the conversation, alright? Teaching is already talked about a lot in the public sphere. Every second day it's in the news, the teacher shortage, teachers demanding more pay, issues that are going on in schools. This stuff's already talked about widely. I'm not adding anything new to the conversation. Alright, with that little disclaimer out the way, maybe the first thing that I can talk about, alright, so this video is just about key differences from my experiences between teaching at an inner suburban school versus an outer suburban school in Melbourne. First major difference, alright, is equipment. Alright, in the outer suburban school, so this was about 60 kilometers away from Melbourne, alright, trying to teach kids that don't bring equipment to school is so difficult. Alright, in my first year of teaching, I'd already worked at a school a year prior as a learning support, and I saw so many kids coming to class without equipment. Alright, no books, laptops weren't charged or they were broken. Maybe 3/4 of the class turned up with a pen. The other quarter of the class, they didn't even have a pen. Alright, they were just human beings walking into the room, usually very late, alright, without any equipment. So you as a teacher having to provide meaningful instructions and trying to educate students who don't bring the tools necessary to learn, it's very challenging. Alright, in my first year, alright, I thought I was going to make a big difference. I was going to be one of those teachers, well, I was going to be a teacher who provided equipment for my students. Alright, in my first year, I turned up with 20 exercise books, all sorts of texters and pencils and scissors and glue sticks that I'd spent my money on, so that the kids in my class, they all had, the potential to learn. And what did I do in those first 2 weeks? I handed out those 20 exercise books that I'd purchased to students who didn't turn up in the first week or two of school with anything. I handed them exercise books, I gave them pens during class, and what happened? Alright, within 3 weeks, alright, maybe one of those students still had the workbook. Alright, the other 19 of them, alright, those exercise books that I handed those students, they'd all vanished. Alright, they'd used them for other classes, they'd been torn up, they just got lost and left on lockers, alright, thrown in bins, whatever. Alright, don't do that. Don't buy equipment for your students. Alright, it sounds nice, but if they're not turning up with equipment in the first place, they're probably going to lose whatever you give them. Alright, in my first year of teaching at the school that's outer suburbs, I'd bought 3 boxes of 100 pens. Alright, so 300 pens I handed out throughout my first year of teaching, and I had none left at the end of the year. Alright, pens that I had purchased and I gave to students regularly in class, and I told them, make sure this pen comes back. Alright, it didn't come back. all right? Sometimes students would turn up and they were the students with, things going on outside of school that were rough. You'd try and help them. You'd give them a pen. You'd say, look, this is what we're doing today. Have a go at this. And then 30 seconds later, you turn around and they've pulled the pen apart. They've got the ink. They're drawing on the table. And I have to clean that up. Right? So, equipment at the first school I was at in the outer suburbs was a major issue, right? Because it's so difficult to teach students who aren't bringing anything, and it shouldn't be, and it's not the responsibility of the teacher to provide equipment to all the students who are turning up not ready to learn. All right, that was a major issue in my first year of teaching, and it's one of the biggest barriers to learning. All right. But providing them with the pens every lesson didn't really enhance their learning, in my opinion, in the first place. They turned up without pens because they didn't want to learn. All right? They turned up without books because they didn't want to learn. By providing them with a pen and with a workbook, all I did was made them aware that, oh, now you can do the activity, but they didn't want to do it. So what did they do? They scribbled, they tore it up, they destroyed the pens, so that once again they could be in a situation where, oh, now I can't learn. All right. So that was in my first school. In the school that I'm teaching at this year, total opposite. The kids, 3/4 of them are not just turning up with a pen, they're turning up with a pencil case, with a book to write in, they have textbooks at this school, they're turning up with charged laptops. It is so much easier to teach when the students are bringing the equipment that they need, and that you as a teacher should be able to reasonably expect that the kids are turning up with. Right? How can you teach content or anything? How can you expect students to learn when they're not able to apply what they're learning to do anything? All right? This year is so much easier in terms of actually providing an environment for students to learn. All right. Last year was a constant fight, all right, to try and get these kids learning. This year, all right, they are turning up ready to learn at this inner suburban school. So, one of the key differences between teaching in inner suburbs and outer suburbs is that the kids are turning up with equipment in the inner suburban schools. Now, I'm only talking from 2 schools that I've worked at, but having been in this program where I talk to a lot of teachers, other teachers who are placed in outer suburban schools, that issue is widespread. It's not limited to that one school I was at. It is a problem in all schools, or most schools in outer suburban Melbourne. And this issue is probably true in other parts of the world as well, all right? Other Western countries, from what I remember reading, a year or 2 ago about education in the West, right, it's struggling. These issues are across all Western countries at the moment. Also talking to teachers who had worked overseas, all right, they said the same thing from the UK, all right. The UK has the same issues at the school that this particular teacher worked at. So, outer suburban schools versus inner suburban schools, all right. Students turning up with equipment is a big difference that makes a huge impact to your life as a teacher, all right? When kids don't turn up with equipment, it is so difficult to teach, all right? Because the kids, they're not turning up ready to learn. All right, next major difference is the level of differentiation that you need to provide as a teacher varies significantly between schools. So in the school that was in the outer suburbs, all right, I had students in let's look at year 9, in my year 9 classes that probably varied in ability level, reading, writing, mathematics from a grade 4, all right, up to a grade 11. All right, I needed to provide resources and somehow provide instructions that varied and that were suitable to a difference in education of about 7 years. All right, it was absolutely ridiculous and not possible. All right, you cannot differentiation is not providing different activities for students who are at completely different ability levels. All right, that is modification. That is planning 2, 3, 4 lessons for every one lesson to try and make something that's suitable for all students. So in that outer suburban school, you've got smart kids everywhere, but you've got kids as well who haven't paid attention their entire schooling, their entire school experience. And so they're really low in ability level. They're at grade 2, grade 3 reading and writing ability, all right? They don't know how to write on the lines. They can barely read 2 sentences together and remember what the first sentence was, all right? You're trying to teach content, all right, that's working towards, year 8, year 9 science. We're trying to get to some complex ideas now, and you're trying to teach very basic things. But then at the same time, you've got students who are quite clever, who have paid attention throughout school, and who are ready to learn the required content. It is so difficult to provide meaningful instructions to such a spread in ability levels. And in the outer suburban school, I found that every class I had kids that were very low, right, in terms of their ability, because they haven't paid attention throughout their schooling. And then you've got kids who are quite high, right, because they do care. And so trying to, make something meaningful, a learning experience that's meaningful for all of those students, you can't do it, all right? I'm one person with one voice, and I can try and teach to the middle, but the spread is so big, all right? I'm not meaningfully engaging the kids at the top, and I'm not even bringing into the conversation the kids at the bottom. That was so difficult, and it was sad because really I was only teaching half the class, all right? At any one moment, I was only ever talking to half the class because too many of them were bored because it was too easy what I was talking about. Too many of them, they couldn't understand it, all right, because they'd never picked up on the early ideas that were essential for understanding this next stuff. Compare that to the school that I'm at now. 90% of the students are at level or above level at the school that I'm at now. So in terms of when I'm talking to the class, I reasonably expect, all right, that 80 to 90% of the students know exactly what I'm talking about because I can pitch the education that I'm trying to provide to their level, all right? I know what the majority of them do and do not know, and I can talk in such a way that encapsulates most of those students into the ideas and into the stuff I'm trying to explain. All right, there might be 10% of students at this school who are probably lower, all right, in ability, and that maybe they don't understand everything that I say, but after I provide the instructions, I can go and see those students and I can provide a different level of explanation so that they can access the learning. All right, that is doable. All right, I feel like I'm educating 100% of the kids in my class, all right, at the school that I'm currently working at, compared to last year, I felt like I was educating maybe 50% of the students. All right, so the level of differentiation I'm required to provide is so different at the school I'm at now because all the students, they've all learned throughout their previous schooling and they're all at roughly the same level. There might be 1 or 2 years difference in ability level. Some kids know a bit more, some kids know a bit less, but they're all about the same level, and that allows me as a teacher to actually provide meaningful instructions to all of these students. So, big difference, all right, just to summarize that point. So before I go on a ramble, my first school, outer suburbs, right, was very difficult to provide targeted instructions to the students because the ability levels of the students varied so much. Right, at the school I'm currently working at in the inner suburbs, the students are all at level or above level, so I can provide more targeted instructions to them to better enable their learning. So it's kind of unfair in a way. If you're at a regional school, all right, not only are you probably more likely to be behind, but your teacher's probably not able to provide instructions for you to actually excel at a meaningful rate in terms of your education because there's too much variety in that class. Whereas at a high ability school or a school where students are all at level or above level, your teacher can provide targeted instructions to you so that you can continue to excel. All right, so that's a big difference for me. All right, so the next difference, all these differences, they're kind of linked, all right? And this is probably the main link, well, attitude is the main link between the differences that I'm talking about. But the next big difference is behavior, all right? In the outer suburban school, you have disruptions to your teaching every minute, all right? Literally every minute, unless you've got the kids to start with an activity, and then you're not disturbing, all right, the naughty kids, and they're allowed to kind of, do what they want. But when you're trying to teach, it is literally every minute you are being interrupted, all right? You've got some kind of a fidgeting noise trying to see if it triggers you, all right? You've got kids poking their hands up mid-conversation, instruction, saying, oh, I want to go to the toilet, all right, can I go get a drink? Oh, I forgot my pen. My laptop's flat, can I go get a laptop? It's just constant, all right? And it's so hard to maintain your trail of thought when you're being interrupted, all right, constantly. Not only that, when you give instructions, all right, and you start some kind of an activity, you are going around consistently, almost not making sure the kids are doing the activity, but making sure they're not preventing others from doing the activity, all right? You're doing your best to, every now and again, all right, answer a question about the content, but the majority of the time, I was trying to prevent students from distracting other students, so that at least those who were in a frame of mind where they might have learned something, they could do that. And it was constantly putting out these little spot fires that were happening around the room every minute. All right, it was behavior management. 95% of my time, all right, in my first school was trying to put out these little disruptive moments that would turn into chaos if you didn't put them out at the beginning. Constant, all right, throwing things around the room, yelling across the room, students swearing at each other, students filming each other, all right, being on their phones. It was relentless, all right? There were fights in class. I had to step between fights, all right? Compare that to the school that I work at now, the inner suburban school. I don't even think about behavior. It is not something that I think about ever, all right? I walk in, I get my stuff set up, and I say, all right guys, listen up. And I look around the room, and in about 10 seconds, there might be one or two conversations. I'll say, you, all right, we're listening now. You, all right, we're closing our laptops. And that's it. They're all there, listening, not talking, not putting their hand up to go to the bathroom. They are there, being respectful, and at least acknowledging that there's other students in the room who are there ready to learn, but the majority of them are. So, the behavior is so different. When I walk around the room after having provided some instructions on what we're doing, right, I know some of the kids are playing games. I used to play games when I was at school, all right? But they try and hide it. You don't walk past them and they've got their volume on max, all right, playing all sorts of inappropriate noises when you're walking past them to see what you'll do. All right, they're trying to hide the fact that they're playing games, if any of them are. Majority of the time, it's amazing. You walk around in a way where they don't actually realize you're behind them and you can see what they're doing, and they're on task. All right, I laugh sometimes, all right, when I see all of these kids actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, because for my first year of teaching, I wasn't used to it. I used to walk behind them, all right, walk around the room when they weren't aware, and what I expected to see was them playing games or doing something totally off topic from what they were supposed to be doing. Whereas this year, when I walk around the room, it amazes me all the time that they're actually they're on the website that I've instructed them to be on, or they've got the page open that they're supposed to have open. All right, it's not every student, but it's the majority. And for the minority who don't have it open, I can go to them and I can say, oh, you're on the wrong page. This is the page you should be on, all right? Or if they're on the wrong website, you can be on that website, all right, at home, but now this is the website we're supposed to be on. It is so much easier to maintain an appropriate learning environment when the majority of the students, all right, behave in a way that's socially appropriate, all right? And they're turning up, again, it comes back to attitude of being there, knowing that they're there to learn, and that they're there to listen, all right? And you know, this is for their benefit, all right? We're trying to make them into adults that have a range of employment possibilities, all right? And so that they can, you know, be best prepared for whatever future the modern, whatever, you know, employment conditions or situation they have in their future. So, behavior, big difference between the outer suburban school that I worked at and the inner suburban school that I worked at. Alright, hopefully you can hear me. It's a bit windy, so I'm trying to cup my hands to block the wind. Next major thing, this will be a short one, is again, it's to do with the previous things I've been talking about, which all comes under the umbrella of student attitude, in my opinion. But this next one is student interest, and seeing that through students asking questions. Right, in my first year of teaching at the outer suburban school, 95% of the questions I got in class were not about what we were learning. Right? They were about lending equipment. They were about am I marking them late? They were about what's the minimum I have to do. They were you know, bathroom related, toilet related. Can I sit? You know, can you tell them to stop doing this to me? All that kind of stuff that's not related to actually what I'm there to teach, which was science. Versus my current school, alright, I would say not 90%, probably 50% of the questions I get asked are actually about the content. Alright, I still get a lot of, you know, bathroom and, oh, I forgot this book, and what page it's on is related, but maybe 50% of the questions at my current school aren't related to what we're actually doing in class, but 50% of them are, which I think is pretty good. All right, I'm getting students ask me about science content, and I love it. All right, and a lot of the time I don't know the answers to it, but I love that students are actually asking me questions about what we're doing, because it's telling me they're actually thinking about it. They're actually aware of, you know, some of the complexities of the topic. All right, they're learning because they know they're asking questions, which shows they're thinking about what they're doing, and they've got some questions because, all right, some of the content, all right, often in schools it's oversimplified, and they're asking questions that show they understand that it's oversimplified, and they want to know the complexities of the topic. So I actually get that at my current school, and I didn't get that, all right, at the first school I was at the majority of the time. Very rarely did I ever get asked about the content. Right, I might bring up some more differences later in a future talk, but maybe I can talk about some similarities now between working outer and inner suburbs in Melbourne. So first thing is the workload doesn't change. Alright, I thought by going to an inner suburban school that was already established, alright, the workload would be less, alright, because in my first year of teaching, I was at a new school, and we had to develop the curriculum, right? I got set, right, weeks worth of science lessons, and everyone did, right? We were in it together. We were developing, all right, lessons from scratch, all right? We didn't have a textbook. Trying to do that is difficult, all right? Inventing lessons from scratch is hard, and I thought that was absolutely ridiculous, because teaching's been a profession. You know, schools have been established for over 100 years in Australia. Why are we making things from scratch? Right? I'm already teaching 20 hours a week. I get 10 hours a week of planning and assessment, and then the other 8 hours is kind of taken up walking to and from class and yard duties and meetings. Why am I taking stuff home, all right, to plan on my weekends, when there's this stuff already available for free, or you can purchase online? Why was this stuff not provided? So I thought that meant that at my first school, the workload was, you know, higher than what it would have been at other schools. But in reality, all right, at the school I'm at now, in the suburbs, all right, the workload really is just as high. The difference is, in my first school, we didn't really have that many assessments, all right? Maybe they do now, so the workload could be increasing. But only once a term did we have, all right, some kind of an assessment task for the students of each class. Whereas at my current school, it's probably about 2 per term, so every 5 or 6 weeks we have this kind of, like assessments for the students, where they go on their, after I grade it, it goes on their reports. But at this school, right, all of the 25 students, they're answering all the questions, right, to the best of their ability. So when they have a test, right, if it's a 10-page test, right, there's 25 students. I'm marking 250 pages, all right, and then I'm putting all of that data into the system. At my first school, all right, even though the class sizes were 25, usually 5 were away every day for whatever reasons. And then out of that 20, only about 10 of them really put some effort into the assessments. So actually making the assessments was super quick, all right? Spent a lot of time lesson planning, but making the assessments was actually super quick, marking the assessments. Whereas at my current school, marking the assessments, I have to take it home and literally spend a whole Saturday or Sunday to do it. So big difference between inner suburbs and outer suburbs. No, sorry, I got distracted then because I walked past someone and I lost my trail of thought. There is a difference in terms of what you're spending your time doing, but the workload is the same, all right? So if you think you can change schools and you're gonna have a lower workload, I don't actually think that's how it works. Each school will keep you busy in some different way. So that last point was about the workload being the same between the inner suburb and the outer suburban school. Just to finalize on that too, I'd heard that same thing from people at my first school when I used to ask what it was like teaching at their prior schools, which were inner suburban schools. They said the same thing, like they always felt like they never had enough time to actually do everything. So even though the issues and the challenges are different, they're all time consuming, all right? If you can get your work done in the 38-hour week, all right, you've either been teaching for a long time or you're not doing something, because everyone that I've spoken to, that I've seen them teach and I think they're a good teacher, all right, they are not getting their work done in 38 hours. That's not to say that people can't, all right? I've spoken to other teachers who said they only work 38 hours and that's what they do. And, they're fine teachers, but the majority of people cannot do what they need to do in the 38 hours, especially the teachers who have additional responsibilities. All right, I thought being a first year teacher was kind of challenging, which it was, all right? But then I thought, oh, well, as you do teaching, it just gets easier. And then you see, all right, the teachers who are in it for longer, they just accumulate extra responsibilities. All right? It doesn't get easier for them unless they say, no, I'm just a classroom teacher. All right? And that's kind of frowned upon, for teachers who have been doing it for a long time. They're kind of expected to take on those leadership roles, even though they don't really want to do them. All right? Some of them, yes, maybe want to do them, but there's some teachers who don't want those responsibilities, but they get pressured into it, and then they're spending, they're not spending any less time teaching. They might have spent 50 hours a week teaching in their first few years, and then they thought they could relax once they got all of their material sorted and they've learned, the curriculum a bit better, whatever. But then they get extra responsibilities and they're still working 50 hours a week, all right? So that was to finalize the point on workload, all right? In my opinion, it doesn't change between the 2 schools I've worked at and talking to others, all right? They would agree, the people that I've spoken to about that. Workload remains high across all schools. All right, another similarity, won't talk about this one for too long, but is the staff, all right? The other teachers, the other people working at the school, from my experience, all right, they don't vary between schools that much. Of course, everyone's unique and everyone's their own person, all right? But the difference between the inner suburban school and outer suburban school, to me, the staff are the same, all right? Same conversations, they've got the same expertise. When you watch people teach, they teach in a very similar way. These things don't vary between schools, all right? Which is interesting because when you're at a school that isn't performing, all right, particularly well academically, you get all of these kind of teacher training, initiatives, and you get talked to in such a way as though the reason that your school's not performing is because of the teachers, all right? And I absolutely disagree with that. from my experience, all right, the teachers are very similar across all schools. I'm talking from 2 experiences, so not many, but from conversations with others as well, all right, this is the general vibe, is that teachers across all schools are similar. The difference in outcomes, all right, therefore, isn't really related to, all right, the quality of the teachers or what the teachers are doing, all right. Another similarity is schools' policies and procedures. Although they do vary between schools, they're really the same, all right? Different buttons that you click and, different forms that you fill out, but really, all the processes at schools, the 2 schools I've worked at, all right, very similar. What varies, all right, is the students. The students are what is different. So similarities, teachers, I think, inner suburban, outer suburban schools, similar. And while I'll quickly knock this one off as well, all right, the school's policies also very similar. The way that they handle, student administration and processes, internal processes, while they're different, all right, in reality, they're kind of the same. So I'm probably getting to the end of this little discussion I'm having with myself, all right, about the differences between working inner suburban versus outer suburban. And I've probably made it sound like working in the outer suburban schools is awful compared to working at an inner suburban school. All right, but I don't want that to be the final message or the vibe that I've given off. All right, I personally prefer working at the inner suburban school because I chose to become a teacher because I like science content, and I want to, all right, be involved in scientific discussions and maybe in the future have a career in science. So for me, working in an environment where I get to talk about the topic that I'm interested in, that's what I'm there for, all right? I'm there to help educate students to become scientists, to work in jobs involved with technology or medicine, all right? That's what I'm interested in. And the school that I'm working at now in the inner suburbs, that allows me to have those kind of discussions. It allows me to get more in depth into the content. I have to learn the content better. All right, that's a big part of why I became a science teacher. I didn't get to do that in the outer suburban school. All right, it was more associated with behavior. All right, I just paused because I was walking past someone. I don't like to talk to myself walking past people too often. So outer suburban school, all right, most of my time was dealing with student behavior and trying to teach students how to behave in a way that was appropriate for society. All right, that is rewarding too, all right? Some people like that. Some people, you actually probably are having a bigger impact on the students' lives in these outer suburban schools than I am on the inner suburban schools. All right, these kids in the inner suburbs, I can give them a lesson plan, all right? And any teacher can walk in there and put that content in front of them, and over half the students, they're gonna do it, and they're gonna learn from it, because they're turning up with a frame of mind ready to learn. But at these outer suburban schools, if you can get the students to do the content, which to be honest, I couldn't really do it, all right? I wasn't that good. But if you can, you're having a major impact on their lives. All right, high traffic area, I have to keep pausing and stopping. So if you can actually get the students to engage with the content at those schools where they're typically not engaged, you are having a big impact. Because if you weren't in that room, those students, highly likely they would not have engaged with the material and they would not have learned if you were not in that classroom. Whereas at my current school, all right, I feel as though if I wasn't there, majority of these kids, they'd still be learning. All right, that is just the difference. At the outer suburban schools, you can have a major impact on the learning of those children. And you can at the inner suburban schools too. But just if you can have that impact at the outer suburban schools, right, that's probably more significant than having the impact at the inner suburban schools, in my opinion. Because those kids, if you were not there, they're not learning, all right? Inner suburban schools, if you're not there, they're still learning something. So that's a big difference, all right? And would be a positive reason for wanting to work at the outer suburban schools is because your presence in those schools is actually having, again, in my opinion, more of a meaningful impact into the lives of, those students, or to any students, the students that you teach. All right, another benefit of working in the outer suburbs, all right, so I got to try and balance it here a bit, is the conversations you have, I find, with staff are actually just better, all right? Because you're in chaos. You're in chaos every minute of the day. You tend to loosen up a bit more, all right, and relax and just kind of, laugh at the situation that you're in half the time, all right? There were so many jokes. It was so funny, right? And there was so much just things happening all the time in that first year of teaching from all of the drama that the students bring to school with them, all right? It made it entertaining every single day, all right? You never knew what was going to happen on yard duty. You never knew what was going to happen in your class when there was a particular student who turned up for the day who doesn't usually turn up, all right? You never knew what was going to happen, and it put you on edge all the time. And for a lot of people that generates a lot of anxiety, and it's not for everyone, but it was definitely entertaining, all right? There was just so many events every week happening, all right? Memorable events constantly happening. Whereas at my current school, there's not really that many memorable things that are actually happening, all right? It's so routine, all right? We just go through the curriculum, all right, week after week, one lesson just on top of the other. The students are learning, they're improving, they're doing what you expect to happen at school. But it's a little bit more boring, all right? I like learning the content. That's what makes it interesting for me, all right? The fact that the students are learning it, and then I get to teach, or think about teaching some more advanced stuff, that I like that, all right? But if I were a teacher of a subject that I'm not interested in, and you were just teaching the same basic curriculum all the time, it would get boring. So, benefit of working at the outer suburban school is it's much more interesting. The conversations I found was better, all right, because you're kind of in this chaotic environment where you just laugh at yourself a bit more. So in my first year of teaching, I used to always ask new staff who would come to the school, or CRTs or whatever, what it was like teaching at other schools. And one of the things one of the guys said to me was that when you teach at schools where behavior and it's just really difficult to teach, all right, so you're not feeling like, the school where students probably aren't learning the content like they should, and you've got all of these other issues. At those schools, right, the bonds and the friendships you gain with other teachers are much stronger, right, compared to at schools where everything just runs like clockwork, and most of your time you're either just with your students or you're planning the next lessons. At these schools where you get a bit more chaos, the bonds that you make with other teachers are stronger because you're going through all this hard stuff together. That's really just how friendships form, all right? The army was similar. You go through all of these difficult situations together and you develop a stronger sense of mateship, all right? That's just what happens when you go through challenging situations with people and you come out the other end of it, all right, your friendships are stronger. And going further with that idea, just someone at my current school, when they did placements in a private school somewhere in Melbourne, they said the teacher culture was toxic, like, because everything's about student performance, and you got to wear a tie to school every day, and I'm not sure what the women have to wear, but they've got to turn up and maintain this persona of, betterness, if that's such a word, all right, of excellence. At a private school, from what I'd heard from this other teacher, the culture there amongst teachers was toxic. They didn't talk to each other, they didn't help each other, all right, they literally just taught their class, sat in their office on their own, and didn't interact with anyone, all right, according to this person, all right. I would say at the first school, when it's more chaotic, all right, it's the opposite. You're always talking with teachers, you're always having jokes amongst each other. At a school, like a public school that I'm at now, which is quite high performing, right, you have good bonds with teachers and good associations, but it's not to the extent like it was at the prior school, which was more chaotic. And then just going off what that other teacher said, at private schools where everything's about performance and prestige and whatever else, the values are at those schools, apparently the bonds between teachers are almost non-existent, all right? You turn up, you do your job, you get paid, you go home, all right? You're just there as a job, all right? And that's it. So, what was the theme of this topic? I was comparing how the
bonds you have with other teachers, how that varies between schools. So, in my opinion, right, even though learning is, the priority of schools, and that's why I'm a teacher, is to help educate students about science. At schools where, learning is rather difficult for whatever reasons, teacher bonds between each other tend to be a bit stronger, alright, as just a way of coping with those additional challenges that they face.
Just one thing I didn't finish talking about before, I think I got distracted when I walked past someone and I turned the video off, is that even though I'm like what I call a content teacher, alright, I became a science teacher because I like the content. A lot of people become teachers because they want to, put their sense of values, right, into students, and help with how they feel about themselves and give them confidence. And I try and do all those things too. But that's not my, reason for becoming a teacher. I would have became a, psychologist or something if that's what my priority was. But a lot of teachers, right, they want to, help students feel comfortable with themselves, right, grow into being, adults that have particular values and contribute to society in, a particular way, whatever. Like, their priority is not the content, it's about shaping the students in a particular way. Alright, I try and do that, every now and again, but I don't think it's my place as a human being to try and, persuade or influence someone to change who they are. But some teachers, alright, I've probably said that a bit, contorted, but some teachers, the main reason they become a teacher is to not teach the content, alright, but to try and, create better human beings or something like that. And if that is your reason for becoming a teacher, then I highly recommend that you do go to the outer suburban schools, alright, where you can have the greatest influence. Because lots of those students, alright, they come from single parent families, kind of borderline poverty. Maybe they live in foster homes, controversial, but maybe they experience all sorts of domestic violence. Who knows, right? But just the statistics show, if you get on any government website and you look at all the, statistical analysis that exists within the state, all right, the further away you get from the city, the more traumatic experiences people tend to be experiencing. And so if you want to, help people with trauma, then please go work at these outer suburban schools, because there's a lot of it and you can have a big impact. All right, that wasn't for me. That's not why I became a teacher. But for some people, that's, what it's all about. And you're probably not going to have a big impact in that space working at an inner suburban school, because the students, all right, they're quite mature, the majority of them. They're well organized, their parents are highly involved in their education and their lives. They do all sorts of extracurricular activities. All right, they're already on a path to becoming valuable, contributors to Australian society. But in these outer suburbs, they need help. All right, not all of them, obviously, but there's a lot more of them who do need help, and you can have a bigger impact in those spaces. All right, so I might make that the end of this video. Hopefully I haven't offended anyone or said anything that's too controversial. Everything I've said is just my opinion. All right, it's from my experience as being a teacher for 1.5 years now, and another year prior to that also working in a school where, to be honest, that's where I actually learnt the most, when I was observing other teachers. So yeah, everything's just my opinion, my perspective. That doesn't make it true. All right, it's just my take on teaching, all right, in an outer suburban school, and comparing that to teaching in an inner suburban school, where there are quite some differences, all right, and there are some similarities, and each school has its own benefits and disadvantages for working at. All right, I consider myself a content teacher. I became a teacher because I'm really interested in science and I want to be thinking about and doing science all the time. But if you're not, a content teacher, if you're a teacher that's more about the interactions with students and, trying to make better human beings, if that's your priority, then you'd probably want to be at the outer suburban schools, all right, in my opinion. So hopefully this video, if you've watched it until now,
maybe I talked about some things that you had thought about, or that you were interested in, and I've just offered a different perspective on those things, or perhaps the same perspective that you already had, and you just found it interesting that someone else thought the same thing. So I'll try and make some more teacher related videos in the future. Just while I went for a walk today, I was kind of pondering my experiences over the last year and a half, and I could put them into a video like the one that you're going to see if you've watched this. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and yeah, we'll see if I do any more in the future.